Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I ask further proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it's my pleasure, but also a sad moment for the members of the Foreign Relations Committee to take this time to celebrate the service of and also to salute the retirement of one of the Senate's great staffers, Ed Levine. Ed is retiring this week after a remarkable 35 years of service to the Senate, a lot longer than most senators get to serve and than most staff up here have the courage to hang in there and serve. In his decades of service, Ed has provided wise and perceptive counsel to two committees and to many, many members, and most recently to the Foreign Relations Committee. His deep knowledge of foreign policy and his remarkable sense of this institution are truly going to be missed, and I mean missed enormously. He grew up and he went to school here in Washington, D.C., before he headed off to Berkeley and then later to Yale. When he was a young man here in this community, he used to ride the streetcar down to Georgia Avenue, where he'd watch the Senators play at Griffith Stadium. And for those who are too young to remember, there actually was a baseball team called the Senators once upon a time. He didn't watch folks here playing at Griffith Stadium. But when the Washington Senators left for good to become the Texas Rangers, I have to reckon that Ed just decided that the U.S. Senators were the only game left in town, and he has been here ever since. He first came to the Senate, Mr. President, in 1976. He joined the Select Committee on Intelligence back then, literally right after it was established. And it was an historic moment. Those who remember their history of the 1970s remember that was a time of great consternation about the covert activities of the CIA, and that's the activities of the oversight of the CIA became a major national issue and concern. And so it was an historic moment when the Senate was reasserting its constitutional responsibility to provide oversight. Ed spent the next 20 years overseeing some of the nation's most sensitive programs and some of its most closely guarded secrets. He was trusted with some of the most secret information of our country because he never had anything but the interests of our country and the security of the nation foremost in his mind. I think that is also borne out in the fact that through the course of his career, he worked for members of both sides of the aisle while he was on the Intelligence Committee. He served on that committee as the personal representative of Republican Senators Clifford Case and then Republican David Dernberger, and then later for Democratic Senators Howard Metzenbaum and Chuck Robb. His work for the Intelligence Committee exemplified a standard of public service that really puts the fulfillment of the Senate's constitutional duties above any other partisan concern. For him, there never was a party issue, Republican, Democrat, or an ideological issue, liberal or conservative. It was what are the United States of America's best interests and how do we protect its security. And he has applied that very same approach to his work on the Foreign Relations Committee, where I have had the privilege of watching him work over the course of the 26 years that I've been here. He worked mostly previously for now Vice President Biden. A few days ago, we held a business meeting of the Foreign Relations Committee, and it was characteristic of Ed's diligence in representing the interests of country above party that Senator Lugar, the ranking member of the committee and who has served with him for a long time, took time to acknowledge his service and to note how constructively he had worked with the Republican counterparts on the committee over these many years. Mr. President, we saw that in large measure last year when we considered the START Treaty, the New START Treaty, in which Ed played an integral role. I might mention to colleagues, when Vice President Biden was Senator Biden and chairman of the committee, he coined a nickname for Ed. He called him Fast Eddie. And the irony of that for all of us who know him is that Ed doesn't do fast. He is one of the most careful and deliberate thinkers on our staff, and that's one of the things that people valued in him the most. It was never a hip shot. It was always based on thinking, research, and experience and knowledge. And his knowledge of arms control, I may say, is encyclopedic. During the New START debate, we had a war room set up one floor below this in the Foreign Relations Committee room with dozens of experts from the various departments of our government and stacks of briefing books and instant computer linkage to the State Department, to the Defense Department, intelligence, and so forth. But often when we had a question, all we had to do was turn to Ed, and he would know the answer from right up here in his head, from his experience. That is not surprising, given how many treaties Ed has helped this body to consider during his career. He worked on the INF Treaty, on the START I Treaty, on the START II Treaty, on the Chemical Weapons Convention, on the Convention on Conventional Weapons. And I just went up to him a moment ago. I saw he was wearing a tie with sword being beaten into plowshares, and he reminded me that came from the Mutual Balanced Force Reduction Treaty, which he said was the only thing that they could agree on, but he's proudly wearing it today. What all of this adds up to, Mr. President, is that Ed spent a great chunk of his life doing his best to help the United States Senate protect our nation from the most dangerous weapons that ever existed. He did it with such professionalism, even, I might add, when faced with personal loss, as when his father died last year right during the consideration of the treaty, but it didn't stop Ed from doing his duty. All of his service here is a real testament to his character, that he earned the respect from the members he served and the staff he worked with is a testament to his great skill and knowledge, and that he has done so for so many years is a testament to his sense of public citizenship and his love of country. So, Ed, we thank you, all the members of the United States Senate, for your service. We will miss you in the Senate, and I wish you personally the best in all of your future endeavors. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Alabama.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we just passed legislation that would raise the debt ceiling, and as a part of that was an effort to reverse the debt trajectory we're on, but it can only be called, at best, a first step. I think pretty much we could all agree on that. Indeed, there was an article in the Financial Times by Professors Rogoff and Reinhart, who've written a book that's gotten a great deal of attention. It's widely respected, describing and analyzing sovereign debt, national countries which have gone bankrupt around the world. And their comments were it's much of what occurred in our debate is like those other nations. The other nations scramble around when the pressure's on with something like a debt ceiling, and they don't really change anything significantly, but they meet the crisis and tell everybody everything's okay, and they say in this article in the Financial Times everything's not okay. Indeed, the debt will increase over the next 10 years approximately $13 trillion, and this package would reduce the increase in our debt from $2.1 to $2.4 trillion. That's not much. But in addition to that, Larry Lindsey, former economic advisor to President Bush, has done some analysis of the Congressional Budget Office score of what the budget would look like over 10 years, and he points out that they were predicting nearly 3% growth the first and second quarters of this year, predicting that as early as this year. And so now we've had a analysis of the first quarter, and economic growth wasn't 3%, it was 0.4%. And the second quarter has initially been scored as only 1.3, not 3%, not 2.7 or that figure. He says that loss in GDP alone will mean less growth in the economy. It means less tax revenue for the government, and over 10 years, it puts us on a trajectory that the government would lose $750 billion. We'll collect $750 billion less, which is about a third of what the savings was to occur in the bill. And Mr. Lindsay says second and third and fourth quarters of this year also are going to be well below that. So maybe we're looking at in this year alone enough decline in GDP, unfortunately, hopefully not, that would wipe out half, maybe more, of the savings that were just passed. But I wanted to point out that I believe many in our Congress, many in the Senate, are in denial about how serious the debt threat is, that we are too often, as Rogoff and Reinhart said, saying the same things that other nations said before economic crisis hit. Indeed, the name of their book, This Time It's Different, refers to what governmental leaders said in those countries, those other countries that went into default, went into debt crisis. Up until the last minute, they were saying, we've got it under control, it's not so bad, this time it's different. Just because our numbers look like they did in some other country, it's different this time. And immediately, out of the blue, a crisis, a loss of confidence occurred, and they had a serious problem. Something like what happened when people lost confidence in the housing market several years ago that put us in this recession. I just say that to say it's troubling, it's worrisome. We are not facing a little problem. We're facing a problem that will require our attention steadfastly for a decade to get this country on the right course. Well, I would note that the President had a press conference today. In a way, it rejected everything we've been talking about in this debate. It really did not talk about the nature of the crisis that Rogoff and Reinhart described. He didn't tell the American people that the real problem is spending that's surging out of control. He didn't say you can't continue as a nation borrowing 42 cents of every dollar you spend. We cannot continue spending $3.7 trillion when we take in 2.2. You can't do that. He's not talked to us honestly about that. He's not sent a signal. He's not sounded the alarm. And therefore, I think a lot of people, even in Congress and some people outside of Congress, sort of think it must not be so bad. The President hasn't told us it is. But more and more people are expressing concern, and there's a growing unease nationwide as consumer confidence shows, as business investment shows. We just got some bad manufacturing numbers yesterday. So things are not looking good, and we've got to be honest with ourselves that this is a difficult, difficult time. He did, however, make repeated statements in his press conference about raising taxes. I don't think that's a good thing to do when the economy is in a fix like it is. He flatly and erroneously, I believe, stated you can't balance a budget with spending cuts. Well, you certainly can. You can argue that I'd rather have tax increases and less spending cuts, but we can and must balance our budget. We can and must balance our budget, and it can be done with spending reductions. Quite a number of plans are out there that would do just that. And he continues to talk as if the problem was the debt ceiling. But the debt ceiling is really a signal that we've spent too much. And we've borrowed all the Congress has allowed the President to borrow, and you can't borrow anymore unless Congress agrees to raise the debt ceiling. But that's not the problem. The problem, as Rogoff and Reinhart said, is our debt. That's a real problem. It's not going to be easy to fix. I wish it were. It's not going to be easy to fix, but if we work together as a nation, we can do it. This country can rise to meet the challenge. I'm totally convinced of that. The President said, quote, and today, and since you can't close the deficit with just spending cuts, we'll need a balanced approach. That means we need to balance our cuts with tax increases. That's what that means. He went on to say, we can't make it tougher for young people to go to college or ask seniors to pay more for health care. But at some point when you don't have the money, we might not be able to be as generous as we were just a few years ago when we had a better financial condition. You see? Isn't that common sense? What do you mean you can't make any changes in how we do business? We're going to have to make changes in how we do business. He goes on to say and continues repeatedly to talk about investments. This is a quote just in the press conference. Yet it also allows us to keep making key investments in things like education and research. Go on continuing to make investments in education. Does that mean we'll continue our current level of education? We'll try not to cut it if we have to make reductions in spending? Is that what the President means? No, it does not. We just had the spectacle last week of the Secretary of Education appearing before the Senate Appropriations Committee asking for a 13.5% increase in education funding. Before the Budget Committee, he's defending that. Just last week, the President's still talking about investments. More. 13.5%. And you know 90% of education is funded by states, cities, and counties anyway. It's not the federal government. It's not the primary role and never has been. We only fund approximately 10% of the money that gets spent on education in America. We can't have double-digit increases when you're borrowing 42 cents of every dollar. Every penny of that increase will be borrowed money. Every penny will be borrowed. Doesn't common sense tell us we might not be able to increase spending this year even if we'd like to? And I would just point out before the Budget Committee, of which I'm ranking Republican, we had the Secretary of Energy testify he wanted a 9.5% increase in the Energy Department, the department that does more to block energy than create energy. And the State Department was projected and was asking for 10.5% in the President's budget, and the President's request to us. And the Transportation Department was to get a 60% increase in spending. Highway bill last year was about $40 billion. I'll just note that this year the highway, the interest on our debt will be $240 billion. So what I would want to say to my colleagues, we are not dealing with reality. Americans know when maybe they're lucky they've got two wage earners in the family and one loses their job. Do they not change the way they do business? They just think they can continue to spend twice as much as their income as if they were both still working? People don't do that, and all over America making tough decisions. No wonder they're upset at us for pursuing this idea that we don't have to make any changes in what we do. It's just very, very distressing to me. And the President said, talking about unemployment, that's part of the reason people are so frustrated with what's going on in this town. In the last few months, the economy has already had to absorb an earthquake in Japan, economic headwinds coming from Europe, the Arab Spring, and increases in oil prices, all of which have been very challenging to the recovery. But these are things we couldn't control. Well, I don't know that those are the big problems around here. Rising oil prices are. Today, oil prices are more than double, just about double, a little more, than what they were when President Obama took office. We've shut down virtually new exploration in the Gulf. We're blocking the production of natural gas in the shale formations that got so much promise for us. We're doing a lot of things that are driving up the cost of energy Then he goes on to say this, which is surprising to me. He's the one that said the crisis was so large, and I think it was a national problem. He said, our economy didn't need Washington to come along with a manufactured crisis to make things worse. We had a serious debate over what to do about the debt ceiling that we have reached. And Congress, the Republican House, went and yielded from $6 trillion in cuts over 10 years, as they proposed in their budget, to taking $1 trillion in cuts up front as part of this debt deal. And the President didn't want, he wanted less cuts than that, apparently. Else we could have, and that's not enough. Of course, it could be 2.4 if the committee functions correctly, and we hope it will.
Under the order, senators are limited to 10 minutes.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that I have an additional 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Well, what I wanted to point out in this chart gives some indication of how we're operating in the Senate and the Congress, and really driven in substantial part by the President's desires. It's a chart that shows the growth in certain programs that are exempt from the cuts, the automatic cuts that would occur if a budget agreement is not reached as part of the legislation we just passed. Programs, all of which we like and hope and wish we could allow to continue to grow every year. Unfortunately, we are not going to have the money to continue to do that. We're going to have to deal with these programs, as well as all spending in defense as well, and other programs, no doubt about it. So you've got, first over here, the Civil Service Retirement Disability Fund. The average annual percentage increase of that fund's cost has been 4.9%. The average annual increase in that fund each year since 2005 through 2010 has been 4.9%. Now, during this time, we've calculated the inflation. The average inflation rate during this time is 2.5%. So that's about twice the inflation rate. The next fund that's here, that those of us who so value the military, I think all of us do, the Military Retirement Fund, it has increased at the average annual rate of 5.4%. Inflation is 2.5. Medicaid, a program that is administered by states but 70% funded by the federal government, Medicaid has been increasing at 8.5% each year. And I think most of us know the rule of 7, where if your money in the bank draws 7% interest, that money will double in 10 years. So this means in about 8 or 9 years, the entire Medicaid program will double at that kind of rate of increase. Inflation is 2.5%. Children's Health, the CHIPS program, it's an insurance program, it's been increasing at 9% a year. And the SNAP program, the food stamp program, has been increasing at 16.6% a year for the last 5 years. 16.6%. So, is this sustainable? I ask. We're borrowing 42 cents out of every dollar. The economy is not going to be growing as much as we would have hoped and expect, and it's not going to bail us out of this so we can sustain this kind of spending level. So all of these are programs we value, we hate to talk about, we don't want to mention, but the odd thing about it was in the agreement that was just passed earlier today, at the insistence of our Democratic colleagues, these programs would receive no reductions if an agreement to cut spending is not reached by the committee. Under the rule, if the committee can't reach an agreement, there'll be some automatic cuts across the board, except it's not evenly cut across the board. These programs are untouched. They are untouchable because our Democrat colleague says we can't deal with them. Well, it's time for us to look under the hood of food stamps. I got to tell you, how could it be increasing at 16.6% a year for 5 years? How could that happen? Don't we need to examine it, be looking at it? We've had no hearings, done nothing this year to confront that surging program. And what about Medicaid and CHIPS? Likewise, those are surging. Maybe even we could save a little bit on some of those other programs that aren't going, that are going above inflation. But what I would say to you, the military now is online under the bill that just passed. If an agreement isn't met, the military takes a 10% cut. That's the baseline military. It does not include Iraq and Afghanistan. That number is coming down and projected to come down dramatically. So I guess I would say, forgive me if I'm a little bit taken aback here about our priorities and about the willingness of Congress to deal with spending that's out of control. I'll tell you what, that's a good deal of money here we're talking about. The Medicaid program is $270 billion a year. Food stamps have more than doubled. It's now $78 billion a year. Alabama's general fund budget is about $2 billion. I thank the chair. I ask for one additional moment.
Without objection.
I notice no one else is here, and I've already yielded the floor had there been someone else.
Senator from Florida is here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that. Well, I should long ago have yielded the floor because he's got something worthwhile to say, I'm sure. Mr. President, so I just would say that we're not dealing honestly with the crisis we're in. The President is in denial. He's not looking the people in the eye and telling us what a serious fix we're in and challenging us all to deal with the reality that we're going to have to change the way we do business. That's what I say, and I hate to say it, but I believe that's true. And we've got to do better. I thank the chair and would be pleased to yield to one of our more talented, insightful new members, Senator Rubio from Florida.
Mr. Chair.
Senator from Florida.
Thank you to my colleague from Alabama. Does a phenomenal job always of outlining the economic realities of it, and I enjoyed. Could have sat here and listened to him speak even longer, but I understand, according to some, I might be the last speaker today or one of the last, so I don't want to keep the Senate open any longer than it should be. We've had a lot of work here over the last few days. I went back and forth today over whether I wanted to speak or not. After all, I think almost everything that can be said has been said regarding the events of the last few days, but I did ultimately want to share my thoughts for a moment as we head into the August recess, as they call it here in Washington. And many of us here in the Senate will be returning to our home states to explain to the people that we represent what we did or did not do in the last few days. First, let me start by pointing out that our republic is an amazing thing. As heated as the rhetoric may have been over the last few days, I think all of us should stop for just a moment and understand that all around the world there are countries that solve the problems we solve through debate. They solve it through civil war and conflict, armed and otherwise. Our republic is an amazing thing. It isn't always pretty. Quite frankly, it's more often than not very messy. But it has withstood 230-some-odd years of pressures and choices, and it continues to do so, even if ultimately what it gives us is not always solutions to our problems. We are blessed to have it. I would remind many like myself that were elected in the last election cycle tightly embracing the principles of our Constitution, that our Constitution is not just a set of words that outline our principles. It gives us a system of government. It gives us this republic, and this republic is valid, and it matters, even when the people who are running it may not be people you agree with. And we should always remember that. What we have here is special and unique, and we should embrace it and be thankful to our God each night that we have the opportunity and the blessing of living in a nation such as this. Moving aside from that, however, the facts still remain that this coming month and every month to come, more or less, this government will spend $300 billion a month. That's a lot of money. It's more than any government has ever spent in the history of man. $180 billion of that $300 billion is money that we collect from the people of our country through taxes and fees and other ways. But we borrow $120 billion a month to pay our $300 billion a month bill. And that's just too much money. That's too much money for Republicans. It's too much money for Democrats. It's just too much money. And although we should be happy that tomorrow and in the days to come we're not facing a default and an inability to meet our bills, the truth is, an undeniable one that I don't think anyone here would disagree with me when I say, we can't keep borrowing $120 billion every month or more. Because the point and the day will come when the people who lend us that money will stop lending us that money. If we keep doing this for long, we will one day reach a day in this country where we will face a debt crisis, but it won't be because of the debt limit or because of gridlock in Washington. It will be because folks are no longer willing to buy America's debt because they seriously doubt our ability to pay it back. It's not hyperbole. It's not an exaggeration. It is a mathematical, indisputable fact that no member of either party would dispute. There's general agreement on this. And there is general agreement that the only way to solve this problem is a combination of two things. Number one, this government needs to generate more revenue. And number two, this government needs to restrict its growth and spending. Because as bad as the $300 billion a month looks, it only gets worse from here on out. For ways that I don't have time to explain in the next 10 minutes, suffice it to say that our economy isn't growing. It's not producing enough revenue moving forward. Meanwhile, all the programs we fund are about to explode in their growth because more people than ever are going to retire, they're going to live longer than they've ever lived, and the math just doesn't add up. These are facts. No one would dispute that. The debate in Washington is not even about that fact. The debate is how do we solve it? How do we generate more money for government and reduce the spending at the same time? And I will tell you, this is not a debate we're going to solve in the month of August. In fact, I believe it will characterize the rest of this Congress, the 2012 elections, and the years that lie ahead. And the division on how to solve it goes to the root of the dispute that we face in America between two very different visions of America's future. By the way, one not more or less patriotic than the other. Patriotic, country-loving Americans can disagree on their future vision of what kind of country we should be. But this division, this difference of opinion, is the reason why, even though this bill passed, this debate we've just had is going to move forward for some time to come. On the one hand, there are those that believe that the job of government is to deliver us economic justice, which basically means an economy where everyone does well or as well as possibly can be done. There's another group that believes in the concept of economic opportunity, where it's not the government's job to guarantee an outcome, but to guarantee the opportunity to fulfill your dreams and your hopes. One is not more moral than the other. There are two very different visions of the role of government in America. But it lies at the heart of the debate that we're having as a nation. And so we have to decide, because Washington is divided, because America is divided on this point. And we must decide what every generation of Americans before us has decided. And that is, what kind of government do we want to have, and what role do we want it to have in America's future? And so the fault lines emerge from that. The solutions emerge from those two visions. For those that want to see economic justice, their solution is to raise more taxes. They believe that there are some in America that make too much money and should pay more in their taxes. They believe that our government programs can stimulate economic growth. And they believe that perhaps America no longer needs to fund or can no longer afford to fund our national defense and our military at certain levels. Another group believes that, in fact, our revenue should come not from more taxes, but from more taxpayers. That what we need are more people being employed, more businesses being created. They'll pursue tax reform, they'll pursue regulatory reform, but ultimately we look for more revenue for government from economic growth, not from growth in taxes. We believe that the private sector creates these jobs, not government and not politicians. The jobs in America are created when everyday people from all walks of life start a business or expand an existing business. I believe, and we believe, in a safety net program, programs that exist to help those who cannot help themselves, and to help those who have tried but failed to stand up and try again, but not safety net programs that function as a way of life, and believe that America's national defense and our role in the world as the strongest military that man has ever known is still indispensable. These are two very different visions of America and two very different types of solution. And ultimately, we may find that between these 2 points, there may not be a middle ground. And that, in fact, as a nation and as a people, we must decide what we want the role of government to be in America moving forward. So let me close by just saying this has been a unique week for me in a couple ways. One has been, of course, the debate that's happened. The other is my family's been here for the better part of a week, young children. We had an opportunity today after the vote to walk around a little bit and look at all the statues and the monuments that pay tribute to our heritage as a people. It reminds us that we are not the first Americans that have been asked to choose what kind of country we want or what role of government we want in our country. It is a choice that every generation before us has had to make. Even in this chamber, as I stand here, you can sit back and absorb the history of some of the extraordinary debates that took place on this very floor, debates that went to the core and to the heart of what kind of country we wanted to be moving forward. And the voice of those ancients call to us even now, that remind us that every generation of American has been called to choose clearly what kind of country they want moving forward. And that debate will continue. It will define the service of this Congress and for most of us that are here now. I pray we choose wisely, and I look forward to the months that lie ahead, that we will choose and make the right choice for our future and for our people. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from New Hampshire.
I ask unanimous consent that the period for morning business be extended until 6 p.m. with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the senator from Minnesota being willing to stay in the chair for a few more minutes before I have to preside, so that I can take this time to express my concern about what's happened with the failure to reauthorize the Federal Aviation Administration. The authorization for that administration has expired, and it's led to a partial shutdown of that agency and to 4,000 workers being placed on unpaid furlough. A number of those workers are from New Hampshire. And while I know that all of us here are glad that we were able to come together to reach a bipartisan agreement on raising the debt ceiling and avoiding a financial crisis, I am deeply disappointed that bipartisanship has failed us when it comes to reauthorizing the FAA. I understand that the House may head home for recess today and for the rest of August, stranding 4,000 FAA workers and as many as 70,000, that's right, 70,000 airport construction workers around the country who are out of work until we can get an agreement. So let me just review for a minute how we got here. Since the FAA's authorization expired in 2007, Congress has passed 20 short-term extensions of the FAA. All of those bills, every single one of them, were clean bills intended to keep the FAA running while Congress decided how to deal with the complicated policy issues of a long-term reauthorization. Unfortunately, the 21st time around, that's the time that we're in, the House decided it was no longer important to keep the FAA operating, and 4,000 people are out of work, while the House of Representatives may head home for recess. Now, I appreciate that there are some significant differences between the two long-term FAA authorization bills passed by the House and the Senate, the most controversial of which center around a ruling by the National Mediation Board on unionization rules. But that's why Chair Rockefeller and Ranking Member Hutchinson appointed members to a conference committee where the House and Senate could work out our policy differences. So far, the House has refused to appoint conferees. Instead, they've decided to stop negotiating and, unfortunately, to play politics with 4,000 FAA workers and their families. So right now the FAA has been shut down for 11 days. And as long as that shutdown continues, the government will continue to lose $200 million a week, about $30 million a day, that would pay for airport maintenance and safety and for the replacement of our country's outdated air traffic control system. So if the shutdown continues through the August recess, we're going to lose over $1 billion in revenue that could be used to upgrade our air transportation system. That's waste of the worst kind, and it makes our deficit problems worse at a time when everybody says they're so focused on the deficits. Now, every day the shutdown continues has a very real, very painful impact on people all around the country who have been furloughed. I hope the House, in leaving for recess, has left open the opportunity to continue to address this dispute and resolve it in a way that will bring everybody back to work. The FAA has issued stop work orders for 241 airport construction projects worth nearly $11 billion that support 70,000 jobs. Again, these are real people who are being forced to make real sacrifices. In my state of New Hampshire, a $16 million project to rebuild the runway of Boyer Field in Nashua will be delayed if we don't pass an extension. Boyer Field is the busiest general aviation airport in New England, and breaking ground this fall on the runway reconstruction project would have created 50 jobs. Instead, because of this delay, construction likely won't begin until this spring, and those 50 people are going to have to wait, something that shouldn't have to happen. The tragedy is that they won't have jobs, not because they don't have the skills or that the project isn't needed, but because the House is playing politics with the FAA. 42 employees at the FAA's Air Traffic Control Center in Nashua have been furloughed, and this shutdown is taking a terrible toll on them. I want to tell you about just one. Steve Finnerty from Bedford. I talked to Steve earlier today. He's a civil engineer, and he's worked for the FAA for the last 15 years. He's the sole breadwinner for his family of 5. He has a young daughter and a pair of year-old twins who are struggling with medical issues. He's already lost nearly 2 weeks of pay, and he's not sure that he's going to get that pay back, even when he does go back to work. He's concerned, understandably, about how he's going to pay his mortgage and his doctor bills and the grocery bills and all the other needs that his family has. And now he's facing the possibility of an entire month without pay. And there are thousands of people all across the country who are stuck in the same circumstance, who want to get back to work, who we need to get back to work. We need them to get back to work so they can pay their mortgages and their children's college tuitions and their medical bills. We need them to get back to work so they can continue to build a GPS-based air traffic control system like every other industrialized country has. We need to get this economy moving again, and that means we need to be serious about our responsibilities here in Washington. Let's pass a clean extension of the FAA. Let's get these people back to work, and let's go about the business of rebuilding a modern air traffic control system like we should have in the United States. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.